The longest-lived of the Omaha-class cruisers, USS Milwaukee had an interesting, if quiet, life. She didn't have the globe-trotting determination of her sister, Marblehead. She wasn't present at Pearl Harbor like Raleigh. No, Milwaukee had a typically routine service life, as most of her sisters would. This isn't a surprise, as the class was already obsolete, and there were many other light cruisers in American service by the mid-1940s. So, why look at this cruiser in particular instead of her more active sister ships? That's simple, as a companion piece to the previous Royal Sovereign video. Because, much like that battleship, Milwaukee remained in service until 1949, well past any of her sisters, due to her service with the Red Navy. Much as the ship, if she could have talked, probably prefers not thinking about that service. Of course, that was only a small part of a career that spanned decades, so it is prudent to first talk about the career of USS Milwaukee before covering what little is known of the career of Soviet cruiser Murmansk. That life began on December 13, 1918, shortly after the end of the Great War. Milwaukee was laid down on that date as the second of the Omaha-class cruisers, the ultimate culmination of scout cruiser doctrine in a lot of ways, as well as an attempt to make up for the fact that American cruiser forces of the 1910s were not the greatest aside from the big armored cruisers. And even those were outdated in concept with the rise of the battlecruiser. The Omahas were very fast and lightly armored ships, though they carried quite heavy firepower for their day. Even so, the resulting ships were generally overweight and cramped, with further issues from leakage and lack of installation. This was another reason that they generally saw second-line duty when the Second World War rolled around, though that is for the future. For now, a quick look at her technical details. Milwaukee, in line with her sisters, displayed about 9,500 tons at full loading, putting her right on the edge of what would become treaty cruisers. Even her more standard 7,000 tons was still fairly heavy for her time. On this hull, she carried no fewer than 12 6-inch guns, which, as mentioned, is a very heavy gun battery for a cruiser of her vintage. Though, as a sign of how transitional this design was, the guns were carried in a mixed battery. Modern twin turrets, one on the bow and one on the stern, with the other guns and casements mounted in stacked pairs on the corners of her superstructure, both fore and aft. This allowed for a theoretical 8-gun broadside and 6 guns pointing either fore or aft, but as is typical with casements, they did tend to get washed out in rough seas. The remainder of her designed weaponry consisted of 4 single 3-inch guns and a grand total of 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, which is an unusually heavy torpedo broadside for an American cruiser. And on top of all of this, they also managed to squeeze a couple floatplanes aboard, as if these ships didn't already have enough tacked onto their hulls. All of this could get up to a blistering speed of 35 knots, thanks to 90,000 shaft horsepower running through 4 screws. This was to allow the cruiser to keep up with the 4-stacker destroyers coming into service at the same time, with the result that Milwaukee also had 4 stacks, and could be mistaken for a Wicks or a Clemson at a distance. The speed and firepower I went over did serve to make these very powerful ships for when they entered service in the early 1920s, though as is often the case with designs halfway between eras, they were quickly overtaken by more advanced vessels. In this case, the treaty cruisers, with their more logical gun layout and larger size. Still, for the period between her launch on March 24, 1921, and her commissioning on June 20, 1923, and the creation of the Pensacola class, Milwaukee was one of the most capable cruisers in the United States Navy, and arguably in the world as a whole. This relative capability did little to change the fact she was serving in the interwar period, though. As is common with any ship in this period, barring a handful of exceptions, Milwaukee spent most of her time on training duties. This isn't to say she did nothing of note, just that there were, as could be expected, few chances for her to stick out. What she did have going for her was a fitting of excellent sonic depth-finding equipment. On her shakedown cruise, Milwaukee sailed across the Pacific from Hawaii to Australia. All the while, she was taking soundings and gathering information on the Pacific for a Pan-Pacific Scientific Congress in Sydney. This was in August 1923, so keep in mind how new that technology really was. And the Navy decided to use one of their fancy new cruisers to show it off. That's an interesting flex for the early 1920s, I suppose. That being said, her early service was fairly uneventful, other than her technical achievements. She spent the majority of the 1920s alternating between the Atlantic and Pacific on the usual fleet problems. It was during one of these periods in the Caribbean that she got to do something different for a change. Milwaukee and the USS Gough, a Clemson-class destroyer, helped victims of a hurricane at the Isle of Pines on October 24, 1926. They established a medical center, provided over 50 tons of food, and fixed up communications equipment, both by replacing telephone lines and providing wireless communication to the outside world. This was good. Maybe not mind-blowing or exciting, but the kind of thing that navies do when there isn't a war going on. After this, however, it was back to the fleet problems, where she would end up getting sunk in simulated combat multiple times, which could be seen as a bit of bad luck, but it's also not terribly surprising. She spent the rest of the 1920s, and indeed the 1930s, on this duty. There were breaks in the monotony, though, such as a thing that she should really be remembered for over was mistreated by the Soviets. Namely, on February 14, 1939, Milwaukee recorded the deepest point in the Atlantic to that date. This was north of Hispaniola, and is, even now, known as Milwaukee Depth in her honor. For reference, it was 5,041 fathoms, or 30,246 feet, or 9,219 meters. A little bit before this, she was rotated to the Pacific in response to Japanese aggression in China. This was in early 1938, taking her as far afield as Singapore and the Philippines between January and April. This was, however, not as unique to her as the Milwaukee Depth, being as she sailed with other United States warships on this duty. But it did set a trend for her, insofar as patrolling in response to aggressive nations is concerned. Because when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Milwaukee was assigned to the Neutrality Patrol. She would spend the remainder of the pre-war period on such duties until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Milwaukee was not involved in that attack, being an overhaul at the New York Navy Yard, but that overhaul was sped up to get her back in service by December 31st, 1941. At that point, Neutrality Patrol moved to proper convoy escort. Such would be her fate for the following 2 years, sailing around South America as part of the South Atlantic Patrol Force. In this, she saw little excitement, as German surface raiders had largely vanished from the seas by this point, and submarines were the main threat. Few enough of those, however, operated in that area. Even when she ventured to Africa's shores as part of her patrol duties, she saw little action. The most excitement she would see was the odd rescue of ships in distress or hunting German blockade runners. In the first case, she would speed to the rescue of a Brazilian merchant torpedoed by a U-boat on May 19, 1942. Milwaukee reached the merchant to find her abandoned and listing to port, with her crew floating in the water. Milwaukee picked up 25, including the captain, while her destroyer companion, USS Moffett, picked up 16 more. Soon after this, other ships, including Milwaukee's sister Omaha, arrived with salvage parties. The fires were brought under control, and the freighter was towed to port by the 24th of May. As for the second case, on November 8th of the same year, Milwaukee joined yet another of her sister ships, Cincinnati this time, to hunt German blockade runners. By the 21st, they had sighted something and sent the destroyer Summers to check it out. When the destroyer got close, the ship tried to use the call letters of a Norwegian freighter. The suspicious Americans continued on. After all, the Norwegian ship didn't have the proper identification signals. Much as the case had been with Sydney and Cormoran, the Allied ships closed in. Unlike that case, Milwaukee and her sister maneuvered to corner the freighter, while Summers closed in. When the destroyer got within 4 miles in a rain squall, It was to see the ship aflame and lifeboats being lowered into the water. The Norwegian flag was gone, replaced by a German flag. As it turned out, they had found a German blockade runner, which the crew scuttled rather than let it be taken by the Americans. Unfortunately, this was Milwaukee's last moment of excitement at sea under the American flag. I've seen reference to her being attacked by an Italian submarine, but I'm not 100% certain on this, since the cited source is in Italian, and I most definitely don't speak that language. She also might have collided with her sister Omaha on May 31st, 1943, though I am not entirely certain of this either. Regardless, Milwaukee would remain on her escort duties in the South Atlantic until February 1944. At that point, the ship was pulled back, apparently quite urgently, to the North Atlantic. The crew had no idea why, but the reason was simple. As with Royal Sovereign on the British side, Milwaukee had been transferred on loan to the Soviet Union. This was a temporary measure while the war continued, intended to only last until the war was over, and the parts of the Italian Navy promised to the Soviets could be transferred over. So it was, on March 27, 1944, Milwaukee set out as part of a convoy to Murmansk. She would arrive there on April 4th, at which point the cruiser was handed over to a Soviet crew. Renamed from the same city she had ended up in, the cruiser, now known as Murmansk, would have an uneventful life in Soviet hands. Technically, the formal handover, after training the Soviet crew, was on April 20th, but the general idea remains the same. For most of her 5 years in Soviet service, Murmansk would be tied up to the dock and only rarely set to sea for training and the like. The only documented action I'm aware of took place on October 30th, 1944, when she sailed as part of a convoy escort. The flagship of the escort, in fact. She would spend 1945 and 1946 on the odd training cruise, but again, not much more than that. Even this had largely ended, apparently, by 1947. Other than, perhaps, fleet maneuvers in 1948. Murmansk would be returned to the United States, and to her old name, on March 16, 1949. Much as with Royal Sovereign, again, the Soviets protested this heavily. And again, in common with the unfortunate battleship, the condition of the cruiser was, well, to quote the U.S. Naval Institute, when USS Milwaukee was returned to the United States Navy in 1949, after being loaned to the Soviet Union for 5 years, one official said it was the dirtiest ship he had ever seen. The rusty ship smelled of stale fish and was full of rats, lice, and empty vodka bottles. I don't know how to say it better myself, other than to end by saying this. Milwaukee outlived all of her sister ships. She was the last of the Omaha-class cruisers to be scrapped in December of 1949. I feel that if ships could talk, she would have been quite sincere in wishing it had come sooner. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.